Secretary JUN YASAY. Thank you so much for joining us. How do you recall the first time you got to meet FVR?
Quite frankly, I never really got to meet him personally until after I was appointed as Associate Commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Okay.
Although I've met his parents, I met his father and his mother. We belong to the same church in Cosmopolitan Church in Taft Avenue, Manila. I've seen him many times, but personally meeting him only came after I was appointed by him as Associate Commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Now, I recall you saying that you had left the Philippines in the time of martial law. This is also the time that General Ramos was the head of the Philippine Constabulary. When you were abroad, had you already heard about General Ramos?
Oh, yes, I did. In fact, I knew that he was one of the more or less light and more restrained member of the martial law regime that was reasonable, that was fair, and this is how I had my impression of him. But I also had the chance to meet his sister, who was Leticia Ramos Shahani. When he visited New York, I was a practicing lawyer there, and it was at that time that I learned about pushing a plan to push then General Ramos to become president of the Philippines. Yeah,
Oh.
this was some time ago.
But this is well after the EDSA revolution.
This was after the EDSA revolution, when I was winding up my affairs as a practicing lawyer in the States. Yeah.
When you were in the U.S., of course, you were watching the Philippines under martial law. Many allegations of abuses, corruption, and so on. How did you see President Ramos in the midst of these type of impressions of the Philippines?
I think, as I've said earlier, he was the voice of restraint. He represented that symbol of restraint. I know this personally because even in our church, the Cosmopolitan Church, of which he was a member, we had a lot of leaders and personalities and members of the church who were reputed to be activists, who were reputed to be anti-Marcos, anti-martial law. And of course, that kind of a situation, when you have church members, of which President Ramos was also a member, and then they would be in a position to somehow make representations with Mr. Ramos to see how they can somehow be treated more fairly and leniently was something that we knew about. And Mr. Ramos was always there to help. He was always there to even make sure that, like one personality I know who is my ninong, Senator Jovito Salonga, who also had problems with the martial law regime then, was somehow, my impression, helped by President Ramos's influence. Yeah.
What were your thoughts about him when he finally did this very dramatic move of declaring his departure from the from the Marcos administration together with Secretary Enrile? Was it a bit of a shock, or what did you think about?
I was in New York then.
Yes.
When I saw this on TV. I was jubilant, but yet at the same time scared. I was not too sure what the outcome of this event would be. But I saw that even in that kind of a situation, you see a person who was ready to die for the country and to restore democracy, but yet at the same time you saw him as somebody who was very restrained, somebody who was very careful that human lives will not be wasted in such a dangerous activity. But it had to be done, and I'm happy that one of those who really did it was a person like General Ramos. Yeah.
And you did come back shortly after the EDSA revolution.
Yes, yes. I came back in February, towards the end of February, right after the People Power. I came back and stayed here for a few weeks, and then left for the U.S. and decided that I will wind up my affairs and come back to the Philippines as soon as
So you
possible.
moved your law practice back home.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Now, at the time, then General Ramos and Secretary Enrile were going through the EDSA revolution. Did you have an inkling, or did you see that possibility of General Ramos eventually becoming President Ramos?
Not soon thereafter. He was already Secretary of Defense, and towards the end of the term of President Cory, there were already talks about making him probably the next president, and there were even fund campaigns to raise money to propel him into and to stage him into that eventuality. And I remember as a lawyer, I did contribute to make sure that that would become a reality. Yeah. So yes, in answer to your question, I was knowledgeable about such a very strong potential that he would be the next president.
Okay.
It was not easy, but I especially when you had the dominant party then under President Cory, who was Speaker Mitra, who was aspiring for the position. But then, especially when President Cory had chosen to favor General Ramos, Secretary Ramos, I was more confident that he would be the next president.
Knowing how politics goes in the Philippines and what it takes to win in politics, did you find that it would be rather challenging to have someone like President or General Ramos at the time as a political candidate?
Yes, especially because as a military man, with the restraint that he had shown, he was very careful. His role as a soldier was not one that pictured himself as bravado or somebody who was prone to violate the rights of people in a martial law environment. I saw in him as somebody who was different from the traditional politicians, who knew what military rule was all about and knew the consequences of abuses under a military regime. And I thought to myself that with a president like him, who was all too familiar with this reality, he would turn out to be a good president. Especially so that I thought that we do not need politicians to be the next president of the Philippines at that point in time. I think we needed more people in the likes of President Ramos, who displayed the kind of leadership that the country desperately needed.
Because he certainly didn't fit the mold of your traditional
No, he
politician.
did not. He did not fit that traditional mold that that we had, the usual mindset that we had. But I knew deep in my heart that he would be a good president. Yeah. In fact, my only regret was when he became president. The period of time that was given him to serve as such was much too small, with the urgent problems that had to be resolved. Yeah.
There's always too little time when you have a good president,
That's right.
and,
And
too much time if it's a bad president.
That is correct, yeah.
Aside from contributing to this campaign of General Ramos, did you actually participate in the campaign?
Not quite actively, because I, I really did not have any experience about campaigning, yeah. But in my own small way, I was trying to win friends, win people to support and vote for President Ramos. My relatives, my brother-in-law, even my father-in-law, were quite active in the campaign for him. But I was more or less quietly in the background, trying my little share of help to make him president.
Now, how did your career in government begin? How did you start off at the Securities and Exchange Commission?
I was recommended to be associate commissioner, and that would that was my first stint in public service ever. Yeah, and I thought it was going to be my last. Yeah, but I had some church members of Cosmopolitan Church who were pushing hard for me to become associate commissioner. Yeah, I had friends who also vouched for me, relatives who also vouched for me, but I did not know, as I've said earlier, President Ramos earlier. Yeah, but then I guess he saw my qualifications, my experience, and finally found myself appointed.
But it was President Ramos who appointed you.
It was President Ramos who
It was in
appointed
the Ramos
me. Yes.
administration. And then you had finally gotten to meet personally President Ramos as Associate Commissioner.
Yes, yes. When I was appointed as associate commissioner, and I only learned about it because it came out in the papers that he had signed
you.
my appointment. Yeah, and then after that, a few days thereafter, I got a call that he wanted to talk to me, and for the first time, I saw him, and he spoke to me and told me about the fact that he wanted, people who were reform-minded, yes, about the need to really bring about the necessary reforms in the capital markets, where the goal was to make sure that investor protection was the objective. Yeah, and this was not even long. The reason for my having been called was because I had information also that one of our church members had died. Yeah, and at that point in time, I had that opportunity to see him for the first time. Yeah.
What was it like working for government in the Ramos administration?
Oh, to me it was an opportunity that really gave me so much enthusiasm, that inspired me. Yeah, because I was keyed into reforms. Yeah, and when I saw, even before I was appointed as a SEC Associate Commissioner, President Ramos had taken that bold step of unifying the stock exchange. That to me was something that was almost impossible, but it took political will for President Ramos to do that. And I found that as an important move to make sure that changes would be taking place. And then through the Secretary of Finance then, Secretary Bobby De Ocampo, and rightly or wrongly, this was what she honestly believed in. She honestly believed that, it was very important in protecting investors to tell them exactly, the SEC telling them exactly what stocks to buy. A merit-based system. Hey, you should buy this because this is a good stock. But the truth is that the SEC is not in a position, is not qualified to make this kind of judgments. And the truth is that the best way for the SEC to protect the investor was just simply to give them the fullest information about the company and the stocks that the company is trying to sell, and they make that intelligent decision of whether to buy or not. This was at the core of that regulatory philosophy, And I saw the president, to Secretary Bobby D. Ocampo, pushing hard for this kind of a policy. And I found it really exciting to be part of that. And then eventually, true to my suspicion, I became the chairman of the SEC about a year and a half after I was appointed as associate commissioner. I was first appointed as acting chairman, and then a year and a half later, I became a permanent chairman.
The chair at the time retired, or did she step down earlier?
I think he stepped down. He resigned. He resigned, and so with that vacancy, I stepped in and filled in the remaining term that she had. Yeah.
What are some of the other major reforms you had to push as chair of the SEC?
You see, the capital, particularly the stock exchange, was at that time even more perceived as an old boys club, a very exclusive club. Nobody really understood it, what it was doing, and that's why you saw investors who were very limited, people who became more victims if they did not know what the stock market was all about, and they invested in the stock market. So the kind of reform that we wanted to do was to see how we can democratize and expand the investor base of the market. And we had to get, the man on the street, the average professionals, individuals, retail investors to come into the picture. We knew that somehow, even as Filipinos were not keen in depositing their money in the bank, they somehow were able to make savings one way or the other. Sometimes itinatago nila yung pera nila sa baol, no? So we said we have to tap this, and we had to do this through a vehicle. And again, thanks to President Ramos, who saw the need of making sure that these publicly owned or government-owned corporations will be privatized, among others like Petron.
Yes.
And privatize, and then again open it up for public offering the shares of Petron. And that was the first most successful IPO of a then formerly publicly or government-owned company that was privatized. And all of a sudden, you had 500,000 stockholders of Petron after the IPO. Yeah, you had pedicab drivers, you have jeepney drivers, you had teachers, who invested. They were so excited. And this was, to me, one of the dramatic results of that reform. Unfortunately, you had to sustain it. And we were not able to sustain it because towards the end of the term of President Ramos, now you see the Philippine stock market really, even up to this time, not taking off the way it should have, as compared to our neighbors, who were even at that point in time when we started behind us in progress.
Your term, did it go beyond the term of President Ramos? Your term as SEC chair?
Yes, I was extended for another term. In 1997, more than a year before President Ramos' successor took over. And my term, if I completed it, would have ended even after the successor, President Ramos, would have served as president, who had only a 6-year term. And I had a 7-year term, so about a few months later. But unfortunately, things did not turn out well. I had chosen to resign because to fight for the position, thinking that you were on the right, was inferior in terms of importance to really making sure that you're able to sacrifice your personal ambition for the interests of the country, for a larger interest, for the bigger picture.
When you were in the Estrada period, must have made you miss everything that was about the Ramos administration. Um, what was your own take on President Ramos's sort of reform philosophy or his philosophy towards what he wanted to change? No? If I would specify that these twin pillars of people empowerment plus global competitiveness, what were your thoughts on that, and how did you try to exemplify uh, the reform philosophy of President Ramos?
You know, uh, what I really was so profoundly impressed about, and this made me fully understand the keenness and the sincerity of the president as a reform-minded president, was the objectives that he wanted to achieve. He was very much interested in shedding off the image of the Philippines as the sick man of Asia. And that's why he came up with his slogan, Philippines 2000, that underscored the philosophy and objective of the Philippines becoming a newly industrialized country by the year 2000. And this to me was really something that excited me so much. And I knew that with that kind of objective clearly laid out, the man was sincere. And we had to play our share in our role as his members of his official family. And this was also the thing that motivated and inspired us. You know, along that line, I had only one instruction from President Ramos. He never talked to me again and told me about this is what you should do or interfered with anything that we did. But he just simply said that, you know, I want you to do your job. And just to fully understand, I was the one who appointed you. And because I have my trust in you. And I hope you will not betray that trust. So this was the kind of instruction that really pushed every individual. I'm sure with that kind of a statement from no less the president,
Yes.
and then said to you, what else can you do but to do your best? Yeah.
Are there any interesting stories or anecdotes you recall about President Ramos? Maybe some behind the scenes incidents or
The first anecdotal incident that I had with the president was when I had the chance to lead in the opening prayer in one event in Malacanang. And in my prayer, I extolled the president as a Joshua in our midst, somebody who was not afraid to confront the giants that one faces, you know. It was somebody who went out to explore. And I saw the twinkle in his eyes, and I thought he liked that. Yeah. And I did not say this, you know, tongue-in-cheek or anything because I wanted him to be impressed, but I saw this because this is what I saw in the person. Yeah. There are many other funny incidents that I had with the president. I'm even trying to recall many of them, but it's escaping me right now. Yeah. Yeah, I remember one now. We were playing golf. Yeah. And we had I had a friend who was also the president's friend, who became the champion of that golf tournament. And I introduced him again to the president. Oh, you see, You have here, Mr. President, Ambassador De Leon. We fondly called him ambassador, although he was not an ambassador. The only reason why we called him as ambassador was because he was wearing diplomatic plates that he bought a car from an embassy official of one country, and then he was allowed to use that plate, the blue plate, for a few months. So we called him Mr. Ambassador. And then after that, the president comes to me and whispers my ear, "Did I appoint him as ambassador?" This is something that I thought one of the things that I saw how human he was. Yeah.
One thing that you found inspiring in Ramos' the presidency is this reform agenda. I'm sure when you engage in any kind of reform, there's always those who will be offended by it and who will resist. Did you have to deal with these forces?
Yeah.
Knowing that you're behind, you're also
Many
behind
times,
Ramos's.
many times. Not only me, but even President Ramos himself. Yeah, he warned us. It's not easy to make change a reality. There will always be the oppositors to change. Yes. So not only must you make sure that change takes place, but you must also manage the change. Yeah. And he warned us about bad habits or past practices, difficult to get rid of. Yeah, policies that are also difficult to get rid of. Yeah. And so many times we saw this resistance, and the most difficult and challenging resistance that I personally was confronted with was the resistance from the exchange.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. And the resistance came from the small mom and pop brokers. Yeah. And we still have them in the present stock exchange. Yeah. You see, at the time when I was chairman, we only had about less than 200 shares that were actively traded in the stock market. That included the blue chips and so on. Really? And I'm talking about actively trading. But you had other companies who sold their shares, but their shares were inactive. Nobody was buying. Yeah. That's why you had a lot of backdoor listings that came in after that. But you see, with these mom and pop brokers, you had 250 of them. The vast majority of the brokers and dealers in the stock exchange were these mom and pop brokers, and said, "Hey, you should be lenient with us. You should not force us to put up big capital because we're small. Yeah. You should in fact help us." And I told them, in the stock market, there is no place for smallness. You must be big. You must be able to compete, and you cannot compete when you're small. And I went and I showed to them the examples of brokers and dealers in other countries, in Asia, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Thailand, where you had only 50 brokers and dealers who were financially strong, professional and competent, who could put up banks if they wanted to, big banks for that matter. But since they chose to be involved as brokers and traders in the stock market, they had to be big. And that's why these markets overtook us in terms of performance. And so my goal at that time was to reduce the number of stockbrokers to 50. And I had encouraged the small stockbrokers to merge with each other so that they will grow bigger and comply with the increased capital requirements that we had put up then.
Were you able to reduce the number? successfully?
No, because all of the reforms that we put up with the Ramos administration suddenly what were discarded. Yeah.
And you had said that, well, certainly there was not enough time to put in place all the reforms you would have liked to have seen under Ramos administration. Did you participate in any way in the efforts to extend President Ramos's term, either by pirma or
No, I did not. But at heart,
initiative?
I was personally in favor of it. Yeah, unless he was allowed to run a second time. But unfortunately, the Constitution restricted him from doing that, and he did not push for it. Yeah, there was an initial initiative to make that possible, but there were people who really wanted to stand firm on the present Constitution. Without referring to extending the term of the president by a constitutional amendment, I was pushing for constitutional reforms at that time, because I found that even in managing the capital market development program of the country, that one of the stumbling blocks or hindrances to our really growing economically and financially and developing the capital market was the restriction on strategic areas of business, limiting them to Filipinos or Filipino citizens. On paper, that appears good.
Yes.
But when this constitutional provision was inserted or incorporated in our 1935 Constitution and then carried over to the present Constitution of 1986, people were rejoicing. People were dancing in the streets because they were saying, hey, now, this is a very favorable pro-Filipino policy where you'll have Filipinos only being able to own these strategic areas of business. But they did not see that the Filipinos who would be engaging in this kind of business were the elite, were the oligarchs who had the money. The majority of the Filipinos, the vast majority, in fact, will not be able even to participate. And so the opposite of a free market, of competition, came into being even much stronger. You had a monopoly
Yes.
by the Filipino oligarchy of these businesses, and that has also prevented our growth even up to this
Even up
time.
to this day.
Yeah.
So you
But-
still advocate constitutional reform
Yes,
to
yes,
this day?
yes. Unfortunately, while I was pushing for this as chairman of the SEC openly, there were those who felt that this might be a Trojan horse to allow other amendments to the Constitution.
Which
And
are not
it died there.
necessarily, which are not necessarily bad.
No.
If we had gone and actually truly reviewed
certainly.
the Constitution.
If you remember before, Great Britain had the same nationalistic provisions. All areas of means of production were nationalized and things like this. Even transportation was nationalized. And then they finally decided even power was nationalized. And then they decided, well,
Just remove it.
investors cannot run away with this, and they opened up. And they've been successful. I think this is one urgent thing that we must continue to push for. If that's the only constitutional change that we must have. Yeah.
Well, Secretary Jun, you joined the government again in recent times. Were able to bring with you some of that learning, philosophy of the Ramos administration into your own work under the Duterte administration?
Yes. In fact, I was fortunate to be under the administration of President Ramos when I was appointed the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. Because while I started out and really laid the foundations of our independent foreign policy under President Duterte, which did not mean that we should be anti-American, shift away from friendship with America, and be
Yes.
friends with China. This did not mean that at all. It only meant that the national interest would be paramount over the interests of other countries. It must first be first. And so, while I was pushing for an independent foreign policy in that context, I really had the philosophy that I imbibed from President Ramos's administration, which is interdependence. Yeah. Nobody is really an island on its own. No country is really an island. We have to be interdependent with each other. And this is the kind of policy that I pushed hard for in forging the independent foreign policy as the first Secretary of Foreign Affairs of President Duterte. So I even in the matter of this conflicting territorial claims
Yes.
in the South China Sea, and we had in our favor the ruling of the arbitral tribunal. I was happy in my heart that this had happened, because it was really an achievement for the Philippines to be recognized by the tribunal as owning, or rather having exclusive rights to that economic zone within our 200-mile limit. But I had to exercise restraint in managing that development. I did not want to be provocative, because our territorial dispute, for instance, with China, constitute a small percentage of the total picture of our relationship and potentials of benefits, of mutual benefit with China. And we had to also make sure that we are able to strengthen that other areas. And that's why learning from the Ramos administration, I knew that while I had to recognize this kind of restraint in not gloating or about our victory,
Yes.
I was more conscious about trying to use this as a stepping stone towards opening up more mutually beneficial interests or areas of working together. You know, Tony, one of the anecdotes I remember is one time when I and my wife were with the president in the palace. We're just having an informal talk. And my wife was the head of the Population Commission during the Ramos administration. But when we went there, my wife was heavy with a child. And then somebody who was with us, with the president at the time, said, Director YASAY, you are referring to my wife. You're the head of the Population Commission, but now you're pregnant. I mean, you are probably one of those even making our problems on population more difficult. And the president came up with a very nice retort and said, no, that's exactly what I mean when we talk about population management. You know, you could have your child when you're prepared for it.
Yeah. Yes. Not.
And Mrs. YASAY is prepared to have that child. That, to me, is the right way to manage our population. And to me, that was a very succinct way of describing the policy that, even in a joking manner, in an anecdotal manner, the kind of policy that my wife had to push for under the Ramos administration, it was also reform-oriented,
Yes. Yes.
which
That's
even the church had strongly opposed. Yeah.
So it's
And,
a husband and wife going against the tide, so to speak.
Yeah. In fact, it was kind of nasty because there were those in the church who were saying, Mr. Ramos is, look at what is happening. He has Mrs. YASAY, who is the one in charge in violating the rules of the church in terms of the use of birth control. And then you have her husband, who is the chairman of the SEC that controls all companies and at corporations in the country, saying that in a very bad light. And but I thought that incident in the palace was something that was very nice. I wish I had the opportunity to talk about it more. Yeah, but. I saw that wisdom in the president in saying that. Yeah, again, it was said in a very joking manner. Yeah.
Only and then classic Ramos.
Yes, classic Ramos style.
So, Secretary, let me ask you for a parting shot.
Yeah.
A message based on either your past experience, your thoughts on the life of President Ramos and how it has loomed large, and its legacy for the future of the Philippines.
Yeah. In one of my more recent chats with the president, he had always been describing the role of a president as a skipper of a ship. Yeah. Referring to the president as the skipper of the Philippine ship, where the president must be able to safely navigate that ship with its 105 million population to safety. And he has been using this as a metaphor in trying to describe the role of the president, not in terms of picturing somebody who would have a dictatorial stance, would have a strong arm in trying to push for his leadership and goals, but somebody who is more friendly, who is more fatherly as a leader in the nature of the skipper of the ship. But I also see in this metaphor of the president that to be a skipper is not to be scared. In fact, to be a skipper is to be bold. And I find wisdom in his using the ship as the metaphor, because I remember an old passage which says that a ship in harbor is safe.
Yes.
But that is not what ships are built for. And I think this is what President Ramos is trying to convey to all of us, especially to the present head of our nation,
Sail
President
on.
Duterte.
Secretary Perfecto, JUN YASAY, thank you so much for your wisdom and your experience.
Thank you, Tony, for this opportunity. My pleasure.